The problem was in their faces. When these bodies came out, they did not have the features anyone expects in the heart of Asia. Many were tall, their eye sockets deep set, their noses high and narrow, their hair running from pale flaxen to deep rust red, every strand kept by the salted ground. To the first researchers standing over them, these looked like people who belonged thousands of kilom to the west. And yet there they were in the driest corner of western China. The clothes only made it worse. These were not people scraping together rough hides to survive. They wore woven wool, some of it patterned with twill and checks that reminded people of textiles made far away in Central Europe. There were felt hats, carefully shaped, and one man was reportedly buried with a whole collection of them. Material culture with a sense of style in a landscape that offers no clue where the knowledge to make it came from. So you stand over a body that should not be here. Everything about it wrong for the map in your head, and you ask the obvious question. The obvious question, start with the plant because it keeps showing up. Sprigs and pouches of ephedra appear again and again in these graves tucked against the bodies. Researchers have offered readings of why, something medicinal, something ceremonial, but those are interpretations reconstructed from context, not anything these people left behind to confirm. What you can say flat out is that it was deliberate, done over and over across the whole cemetery. Music. And this was not some little curiosity. It was a genuine problem. These people were living deep in the Torm Basin more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road ever cracked the region open to trade. Centuries before the Han Chinese established themselves there. Well before the Uyghur populations who live there today ever arrived. They came before almost everyone the written record accounts for, and they looked like they had no business being there at all. The scholar who did the most to drag these bodies in front of the world was Victor Mayer, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who ran into them and could not let the question go. And it is the same question you are already asking. How do people who look like this end up in a place like this? Where on earth did they come from? Quick thing before we go further. If a mystery like this is your kind of thing, do me a favor and subscribe right now, because the theories you are about to hear all lean on one assumption, and their own DNA is about to take that assumption and blow it apart. Music. You do not want to miss the moment it happens. The roots west here is the pattern hiding inside all those theories. Every serious one started from the exact same assumption. These people came from somewhere else. The only real fight was over the route. One idea pointed to the Afaneo, a Bronze Age herring culture from the steppe country up north around the Alai Mountains. In this version, tied to the work of scholars including J.P. Mallory and Victor Mayer, the Tar people descended from steppe migrants who pushed south into the basin, maybe carrying with them an early form of Takuran, an extinct branch of the Indo-European language family that would later show up in the region. Clean story, right? Herders move, herders spread, and the language and the faces ride south together down the same road. A second idea looked towards Central Asia instead to an oasis civilization called the Bactria Margana Archaeological Complex, a sophisticated web of settlements off to the southwest. In this reading, the founders of the Terran population came out of those irrigated cultures, hauling their farming and their crafts along with them. A third looked to the inner Asian mountain corridor, a chain of high valleys and pastures that could have funneled people down into the basin from the north and the west. 3 theories, 3 different maps. But notice what they all share. Every one of them draws an arrow pointing inward toward the tar from somewhere outside it. Nobody was arguing whether these people came from elsewhere. They were only arguing about which elsewhere. And that one shared assumption is the trap the whole field walks straight into. Blood and borders. And the genetics available back then, they only made the fog thicker. Samples reportedly smuggled out of the country in the early 1990s were said to show links to European ancestry. Then later, a team led by Li Jin at Fudan University reported in the 2000s a more mixed picture, one that turned up East Asian and even South Asian genetic markers among the remains. That finding got contested. Mayer and others pushed back on it, and the whole picture just stayed unsettled. A scatter of partial results pointing in different directions and resolving into nothing solid you could actually stand on. And it gets more tangled, because by now the mummies had become political. To many Uyghur communities in the region, these ancient bodies were ancestors, and their presence got taken as proof of a deep prior claim to the land, rooting in the Darim that ran beneath every later arrival. The Chinese state grew wary of exactly that argument. Access to the remains tightened. Foreign researchers found it harder and harder to study the bodies directly. And the science got tangled up with a dispute over who belongs to that land and for how long. Now, none of that is a fight this story can settle. And I want to be straight with you about it. The archaeology and the modern politics are two separate questions that just became really hard to keep apart. So, picture where things stood as the 21st century opened. A world-famous mystery. A set of striking bodies with Western-looking faces in a Chinese desert. Several competing theories, each with its own homeland and its own journey. Every one of them taking for granted that these people were newcomers. And underneath all of it, a set of remains that almost nobody outside China was allowed to test with the one tool that could actually settle it, reading the code. That tool was their DNA. And for all those decades of arguing, it had never really been read. Sit with that for a second. The whole fight was over a road these people supposedly traveled. And the one record that could not lie about where they came from was sitting inside them the entire time, unread. Then the answer landed October of 2021 in the journal Nature, in a paper on the genomic origins of the Bronze Age Tarim Basin mummies. It was led by a researcher named Fan Zhang, working with an international team that included Christina Warner, an anthropologist affiliated with Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, and Chengwan Zhang, an evolutionary geneticist, music, who had spent years chasing exactly this. For the first time, somebody was going to read the founding population of the Tarim Basin music straight from their own genomes. They were careful about it. The team pulled genome-wide data from 13 of the earliest individuals in the basin, 11 of them from the Zayawai Cemetery itself, plus several more from the neighboring Zongarian Basin to the north. These were not stragglers who showed up late. These were among the oldest people the region ever produced, dating to roughly the early second millennium music, before the Common Era. The actual founders, the ones every theory had been trying to explain. And the logic going in was dead simple. So hold it in your head. Where there is migration, there are genes. If these people had come from the West, music, from the Afano steppe, from the Central Asian oasis, from anywhere at all, that homeland would have left a signature, music, stamped into their DNA. Find the signature, find the road. That was the whole plan. All they had to do was read what was there. So they did. And what they saw made no sense at first. The road that wasn't. The road was not there. I want you to sit with that for a second. There was no detectable Western steppe ancestry in these people. No Ophanis signal. None of the genetic fingerprints a migration from the West or the North would have left behind. Decades of arguing over which journey these people made. And the genomes came back with a verdict that fit none of them. The Tar founders had not come from anywhere else. They were a genetically isolated local population descended from people who had already been living in and around this region since the early Holy Sign thousands of years before the first grave was ever dug. And the makeup of them was striking. Roughly 72% of their ancestry trace back to a lineage geneticists called the ancient North Eurasians, and music, the rest, about 28%, came from an ancient Northeast Asian source. Read that back, because it is the whole reversal in one line. Every theory had been a different answer to the same question. Which faraway homeland sent these people? And the genomes replied that none of them did. Here is the part that gets under your skin. All around them in that same Bronze Age, the neighboring populations were mixing freely, trading genes across the region in every direction the land allowed. The Tarim people were not. Music, they sat right in the middle of all that movement and stayed sealed, marrying among themselves, absorbing no one. A genetic island in a landscape full of traffic. Do you see what that does to the mystery? It flips it completely. For a century, the question was how these strangers got here. Which route carried them across half a continent to die in the sand? Music, And the genomes just erased the question because there was never any arrival. These were not migrants who came from far away and looked out of place. They were people who had always been here, isolated and unmoving, while the entire world turned over around them, which only makes the real problem worse, because if they never came from anywhere, music, then those faces still have to be explained. So, who on earth were they? The ghost lineage. If they were local, the question stops being where they traveled from and becomes who they descended from. And that trail runs straight back to a people who had very nearly vanished off the face of the earth. Geneticists call them the ancient North Eurasians. They were Ice Age hunter-gatherers of the Siberian interior, a people who spread across the frozen heart of the continent, and then, as the glaciers pulled back, faded out of the record almost everywhere they had ever been. For the longest time, nobody even knew they existed. They were a gap, a shape that other populations seemed to require. A ghost you could only see by its outline, never directly. Then a body gave the ghost a face. Near Lake Ball in Siberia, there is a site called Malta. Buried there was a child, a boy who died roughly 24,000 years ago at the peak of the last ice age when ice smothered most of the northern world. His remains had actually been dug up decades earlier back in the 1920s. But it was a team led by Esterv in Copenhagen that finally sequenced his genome and published it. That boy known to science as MA1 turned out to belong to the exact population researchers had suspected but never confirmed. He was the first clear face of the ancient North Eurasians. A ghost made real. And here is why the word ghost fits so well. They left almost no whole descendants. And yet their DNA is smeared all across the modern world. A big share of Native American ancestry traces back to them. By some estimates, somewhere between 14 and 38%. Up to a fifth of the ancestry of many Europeans runs to the same source. Think about what that means. This vanished Ice Age people threaded their genes into populations on opposite sides of the planet. People who never met and never mixed. And then the source itself disappeared. It survives now mostly as fragments hidden inside everyone else. A signal buried in strangers who never knew they were carrying it. Now hold that thought against the mummies, because that ghost lineage, the one that survives almost nowhere on Earth as a whole, is exactly what was lying in the sand of that Chinese desert. These were not distant cousins of the ancient North Eurasians. They were among the best preserved representatives of that lost people found anywhere on the planet, held intact by the salt long after the lineage itself had faded out almost everywhere else. So, the out-of-place faces were never out of place at all. They were simply old, older than any migration theory ever reached for. And it turns out these people were carrying a second secret, one that has nothing to do with their blood at all, sealed and open. Because here is the paradox, the same study uncovered. And it might be the strangest part of the whole thing. These people were sealed shut by blood and thrown wide open by culture at the very same time. Their own teeth gave it away. Traces of milk proteins and the hardened plaque on their teeth showed they were dairy herders from the very beginning. And their diet braided the whole of Eurasia together. Wheat and dairy that came from West Asia, millet that came from the East, ephedra drawn from Central Asia. They borrowed farming, herring, and medicine from every direction the compass offered. And they married none of the people who brought it to them. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because it is genuinely hard to hold in your head. A people open enough to import the diet of an entire continent, and closed enough that not one of the people who carried those goods to them ever married in. Trade flowed freely. Genes did not move at all. They took the entire world's technology and kept their own bloodline untouched. A people who looked like no one nearby, descended from a population that had ceased to exist thousands of years before they were laid in those boat-shaped coffins. Living alone in the sand, taking gifts from everyone, letting no one in. It is one of the purest examples of that split anywhere in the ancient record. And step back because the scale of what those genomes rewrote is bigger than it first looks. This was never really a story about 13 bodies in a cemetery. It was a correction to how the deep interior of Asia got people led in the first place. What the DNA showed was an ancient isolated Ice Age lineage surviving in place across thousands of years, holding its ground in one of the harshest basins on Earth. While every population around it turned over again and again, these people were not some footnote to someone else's migration. They, music, were the last of a world that had otherwise ended. The last of them. So here is what you can actually say. A century of assumptions got overturned by a single reading of their genetic code. And the truth it exposed was stranger than any journey anyone had ever dreamed up for them. They were not travelers who arrived. They were survivors who stayed long after the world that made them was gone. So go back one last time to the desert and to the bodies it kept. The beauty of Lulon, the beauty of Zio. Faces still intact after 3,000 and 4,000 years. Still wearing their felt hats. Still framed by hair the color of straw and rust. For 100 years, we treated them as strangers who wandered in from somewhere far away. A migration puzzle waiting to be traced across a map. And their own DNA turned around and told us something so much stranger. Music. They were the last of a people who were already ancient. A ghost lineage out of the Ice Age that survives now mostly as scattered fragments of code, carried quietly inside billions of us, and almost nowhere on Earth as a whole. And the desert still holds what it is not handed over yet. Sealed graves, restricted labs, questions the sand is kept for 30 centuries, layer beneath layer, still being read one body at a time. So, if this is the kind of story you come here for, the kind where the ground itself rewrites everything we thought we knew, then subscribe and stick around, because there are more of these waiting. And before you go, I really want to know what you think. So, drop it in the comments. If their DNA had never been read, do you think we would still be calling them strangers? That leaves a lesson sitting right in the middle of the table, the one that keeps researchers up at night. Genes and culture do not have to travel together. We tend to assume that when ideas move, people move with them, that a new crop or a new tool always means new blood arriving behind it. The Darwin founders quietly proved that wrong. A people can pull farming from one direction, herding from another, medicine from a third, and weave an entire continent into their daily life without letting a single outsider into their blood. Isolation and cosmopolitanism sound like opposites. And music. Yet here, they describe the same people at the same moment. So if the DNA answered where they came from this cleanly, why is so much about them still unsolved? What the sand keeps. Because the answer did not close every door, and I would be lying to you if I pretended it did. Start with language. Whether these people actually spoke an early form of Takaran, that extinct Indo-European tongue later found in the basin, cannot be pulled out of their DNA. Full stop. The scholar Elizabeth Wan Barber has warned against just assuming it, pointing to a gap of roughly 1,000 years between the mummies and the first written traces of Takaran. Plenty music of time for a language to move in without the people changing at all. Others, like the linguist Ronald Kim, argue the timing could still work. The honest truth is the evidence sits between them, and it is not my place or yours to force it one way. Then there is the scope. As powerful as that study was, it sampled basically one horizon at one site. As the geneticist Vahesh Naraz Simhan pointed out, wider sampling across more of the basin could complicate the whole picture, turning up ties the first 13 genomes simply could not show. And access itself is still a wall. The political sensitivity of the region and the restrictions on foreign research mean the record here is far from fully read. A lot of what these bodies could still tell us is locked behind the sand and music behind circumstance. So here is the honest position, and no further than the evidence music goes. The DNA nailed down where the Tar people came from. It did not tell you their whole story. Music, how an Ice Age relic population ended up thriving alone in the Taklamakan, held together for thousands of music years while refusing every neighbor, and what finally became of them as the centuries closed over that cemetery is still only half answered. Music. The genomes gave you the beginning with a certainty nothing before had come close to. The middle and the end are still being pieced together out of fragments. The last of them. So here is what you can actually say. A century of assumptions got overturned by a single reading of their genetic code. And the truth it exposed was stranger than any journey anyone had ever dreamed up for them. They were not travelers who arrived. They were survivors who stayed long after the world that made them was gone. So go back one last time to the desert and to the bodies it kept. The beauty of Lulon, the beauty of Zio. Faces still intact after 3,000 and 4,000 years. Still wearing their felt hats. Still framed by hair the color of straw and rust. For 100 years, we treated them as strangers who wandered in from somewhere far away. A migration puzzle waiting to be traced across a map. And their own DNA turned around and told us something so much stranger. Music. They were the last of a people who were already ancient. A ghost lineage out of the Ice Age that survives now mostly as scattered fragments of code, carried quietly inside billions of us, and almost nowhere on Earth as a whole. And the desert still holds what it has not handed over yet. Sealed graves, restricted labs, questions the sand has kept for 30 centuries, layer beneath layer, still being read one body at a time. So, if this is the kind of story you come here for, the kind where the ground itself rewrites everything we thought we knew, then subscribe and stick around, because there are more of these waiting. And before you go, I really want to know what you think. So, drop it in the comments. If their DNA had never been read, do you think we would still be calling them strangers?